To understand the origins of the informal settlement that is Kibera slums, one has to delve into its colonial past and that of Kenya and East Africa at large. The British, in their quest for empire, declared the Sudan a protectorate in 1882, the Somaliland a protectorate in 1887, and Kenya a protectorate in 1895. African reaction to the imposed New World Order is cast widely into two spectrums: the collaborators and the freedom fighters. The collaborators figured they had a greater chance of keeping their way of lives by bowing to British leadership and minding their own businesses. This meant that African resources, both natural and human, were now part of the empire. The freedom fighters, on the other hand, could not come to grasps with an imposed sovereignty and spent the colonial period organizing and rallying against the British rule. Movements were organized in Tanzania, Somalia, and Kenya. Examples include the Maji Maji Rebellion, the Mau Mau organization known as Land Freedom Army, and the Mullah Wars of the Somaliland. Sheikh Mohammed Abdullah Hassan was the religious leader of the British Somaliland who ran a sustained campaign against their expansionist plans from 1897 to 1913. Sheikh Hassan ran a sustained movement now known as the Dervish movement, and he is now credited widely with the fight against British Empire in the British Somaliland. In the series of wars between the Mullah and the British troops consisted mostly of infantry, gunners, and porters who were Africans. Collaborative communities offered up their best fighting warriors to be trained by the colonial powers into askaris. Askaris, or British soldiers of African descent. British askaris were a select few, a new caste of salaried and half-literate soldiers, Basoja in southern Africa. The Nubians are one such community that opted to collaborate. The Nubians are a fiercely colorful community that then resided on the foots of the Nuba Mountains. Nubian warriors were fierce and infamous for their battle prowess in pre-colonial East Africa. They had a lively culture, traces of which can be found in Kibra during their elaborate social ceremonies. With their battle prowess in mind, it was therefore no surprise that the British enlisted hundreds upon hundreds of the tall men of the Nuba to guard their empire. Many joined the ranks of the King's African Rifles 3rd Regiment, Company B and C, which was specifically for Nubian Askaris. Company B and C were largely involved in the scourges against the Mad Mullah in the British Somaliland, now known as the Dervish movement. The Dervish movement in the British Somaliland is paramount to the development of the Kibera slum. See East African colonial affairs were largely run from Nairobi, Kenya. Her accessibility by rail to the port in Mombasa and then by sea to Britain and her relatively better communication infrastructure made it a perfect staging ground for the battles of the empire. Company B and C were mostly trained at the KAR military training grounds in Nairobi, which were at a close proximity to the KAR headquarters on Thika Road. This ensured that the British could crush any signs of dissidence among the gun-literate askaris with ease. The Mad Mullah Wars dragged on for a long time, 20 years to be specific. Way before 1913, Nairobi was aflock with injured soldiers, soldiers on leave, released soldiers, and soldiers absent without official leave. These askaris were becoming a sizable community in Nairobi. Originally, Nairobi was meant to be a white man's city. Lush suburbs, golf courses, and Greco-Roman architecture. So this influx of Nubian soldiers didn't go unnoticed with Nairobi aristocracy. It was an eyesore. a quick solution had to be found. The Nairobi aristocracy of the time was powerful and independent from the powers that be in London. They include Sir George Broughton, Karen Blixen, and Lord Errol, a powerful duke. The assumption was that the Nubians would be repatriated to their home in Nuba. This decision was rescinded upon in 1897 after a mutiny by some Nubian soldiers. They were all left to their means. By this time, the Nubian issue was a problem. 4.1 kilometers from the train station that birthed Nairobi, a settlement was developed. Nubian soldiers were shipped to an old KAR military training ground at Kibra, which translates in Kinubi to forest. Hence began the Kibra settlement. The idea was to keep the Nubians at a safe distance from the capital, an observable distance. The British refused to grant permanent title deeds to the Nubians. The logic held was that Kibra was a native reserve and no one had any real claim to these lands. This is paramount to the temporary nature of the housing units in Kibra since time immemorial. The shamba permits given to the Nubians had no real claim. This was government land. Kibra would remain under military control until 1928. The British had taken the Machiavellian approach of imposing fear among their subjects. An eviction always loomed. Demolition of the houses always loomed. What emerged were temporary, easy to erect, easy to dismantle structures. This condition gave the slum its almost pristine, puzzle-like profile of shanties stacked up close. By the time the First World War broke out, Africans were warming up to the money economy. European commodities were in town. Cotton garments were a new fad. To settle this need for money, Africans opted to work for the British. Those who fancied an education and a white and blue-collar job enrolled to the mission centers for an education. The warriors volunteered to the military service with the KAR and were duly trained. The traders flocked to the emergent urban centers. A new breed of African was born, the urbane African. They would migrate to towns to work for the empire during the day, and at night they would reside into their shanties and mud-walled, grass-thatched huts. These industrious Africans led to a rapid boom in the population of Africans living in informal settlements. A gradual expansion of Kibra was in motion. The Nubians who held the shamba permits for the Kibra settlements now took up their rightful role as landlords. They subdivided their shambas, erected affordable housing in the form of shanties, and leased them out. By the 20s, it was by far fair to say that all districts of Kenya were well represented in the informal settlements. The Kibra problem was slowly becoming one. Nairobi aristocracy was terrified. The status quo was under threat. The assumed tyranny in numbers was crumbling. A series of legislation was passed by the colonial government in a desperate bid to regain control of the demographic. These include the 1922 Vagrancy Act, which instituted segregation, necessitated city living permits for those living in the cities, and working permits for those working in white neighborhoods. The 1925 Vagrancy Amendment, the Witchcraft Ordinances of 1925, and the Public Order Act. These laws ensured that Africans settled only where they were needed to settle. Another factor in the rapid growth of Kibra in the 1920s and 1930s was the apartheid nature of the colonial government. In 1922, consultations were ongoing to transfer the settlement to Kibiko area in Ngong. Needless to say, these fell through. Ngong was an attempt to move the problem even further from the capital and the powers that be. The colonial government largely assumed the Kibra problem from the 30s to the 50s. The apartheid nature of British colonialism ensured that the government was largely excluded from the social troubles of its subjects, and purposed on the day-to-day activities of setting up an adequate infrastructure to siphon off resources from the colonies for the empire. During this period, a predominantly Kikuyu population came to call Kibra a home. They had surpassed the population of their Nubian landlords and held the largest piece of the demographic pie. This was largely due to the close proximity of the land of Gikuyu and Mumbi to the capital, and also due to the availability of infrastructure, schools, and mission centers in central Kenya. The colonial government's interest in Kibra was aroused again in 1952 when an emergency was declared. A survey in 1953 during the state of emergency showed that 1 in 3 Kikuyu men had been subjected to interrogation by the British. The Mau Mau were predominantly Kikuyu. Kibra was under constant lockdown during the times of the state of emergency. In reality, the real war for freedom was never waged in the cities, but in the farms where people were disgruntled about their lost land. In 1963, freedom and self-governance was granted to Kenya. The new government made no direct attempt to attack the Kibra issue. Laws were passed declaring some forms of housing illegal. These ordinances were largely ignored due to the government's placency and the high levels of poverty, which meant that people could not afford legal housing. The slum continued to grow. A shift in Kenya's power paradigm in the 1970s directly affected the demography of Kibera. Kenya's first president and a Kikuyu powerhouse died in 1978. This gave rise to a new brand of Kenyan leaders from Western Kenya. Powerful, fiery orators like Tom Mboya and Jaramogi Oginga Odinga rallied their communities to grab a piece of the pie. The Luo and the Luyas began to experience a major migration into Nairobi gradually from the 1970s to the present day. A bipolarity in Kenyan politics then occurred. Politics cast a duality in Kenya. Western community politicians were expected to rally against central community politicians and the vice versa. The Mathare Valley informal settlement took a largely central Kenya demographic, while Kibra now assumed a largely Western demographic. Whether this was intentional or coincidental is yet to be discovered. Multi-party politics in Kenya have then rendered informal settlements a statistic. Minimal to zero social development is given to informal settlements, leading to an all-round disenfranchisement of what is frankly the most industrious social class of not only this, but many countries of the world. Kibera has now grown into the largest slum in the world, occupying an area of around 4,129 kilometers squared. She is comprised of 7 districts. A large number of challenges are faced by Kibera's residents on a day-to-day basis. Insecurity, including muggings, rape, fires and electrical faults. Kibra residents have to keep up with substandard housing, which exposes them to harsh weather, lack of privacy, and a breakdown of the family dynamic. Joblessness has led to an overall moral degradation, leading to prostitution, human trafficking, drugs, and overall crime. Poor sanitation continues to be a major problem in Kibera, with open sewerage, no trash collection protocol, polluted rivers, and evidences of superbacteria in Kibera's sewage tracts. An overall lack of social amenities, e.g., hospitals and enough schools, is experienced. Children suffer malnutrition, there is ignorance, and the people are used as political pawns in Kenya's violent political history. The story of the Kibra slum is still being written. Great culture and art have arisen from Kibra. Kibra has also been home to a lot of celebrated Kenyans, including politicians and musicians. These include Octopizzo, Shafi Weru, DJ Pinye, Abel Mutua, Johnson Mwakazi, Larry Asego, and the footballer Dennis Oliech. While Kibra remains a symbol of the struggle in third world countries, Kenyans look upon her with optimism and hopes for better days. The Nubians of Kibra remain a resilient community despite the disenfranchisement and are still a symbol of East Africa's eternal attempt to move on from her ugly colonial past.